Went into Middlefield when he was 3. He'd come from a children's home because where he was placed by his mother, although he didn't know this and he didn't know what his background was. He didn't know. His mother, we found out later, was an unmarried parent who wasn't able to keep the child, so she just put him in this children's society, I think it was, home. And then he was moved from there into Middlefield when he was 3. He was there until his mid-20s, I think it must have been, and he was moved out and went to work in Greswold Hotel in the kitchens, and there was no preparation. They were just sent out. They were found, I think they were placed in bed and breakfast accommodation, but I think that was found for them. They weren't left to find that, but they were found bed and breakfast and found a job. They were always the same ones. There was Greswold and a few of the other hotels and Solihull Hospital and places like that that took them, if you like, and then left to fend for themselves from then onwards. And I think John really struggled with that time in his life. He was a very anxious man, actually, very anxious, and he got very agitated by things. And I didn't know him then. I knew him in 1992. And he always gets very agitated, and I should imagine he would have been the same, just dumped, really, feeling that he'd always had somebody to care for him or staff that he could go and ask if ever he wanted anything. And that was going to go, and I know that would have made him incredibly anxious, given the sort of guy he was. I don't think John came out of Middlefield with more than a very tiny bag of belongings. I've never seen anything, and I've always looked after his stuff for him, and there's nothing that he would have had, which is the other thing that I've always felt is quite sad. You know, you keep your precious little bits, don't you? But there's nothing that he would have had for them from the first 26 years of his life. Generally, I think for all of us that don't live in institutional care, you've always got somebody feeding you as you're growing old about what goes on. You might not think they are, but your parents and your family and your school all around you, you're learning about the world, what goes on in everyday life. But John went to school in the institution. He never came outside apart from the walk around. That was the only world that there was. So to suddenly have to cope with what goes on, I think was pretty traumatic for him, really. He was happiest when he could meet up with the people that he'd consider would be brought up with, really. Always wanted to know what they were doing. Everybody else, he could tell you, even after those 50 years, he could name everybody and tell you something about everybody. And the staff, he knew all the staff's names. He could tell you which staff he really liked and which staff he wasn't quite so keen on, really. For the information I ever got from him, I would never have said that it was a particularly unhappy time. It was just an institutional time, and the way that institutions are different. I think the most stressful time was he actually being told that he'd got to leave, that he couldn't live there anymore. And the way I knew him, that would have really thrown him into a terrible anxiety state, I think. And that, I think, was the worst time for him, not the time that he was in there. Funny, isn't it, really? You know, I think everybody else tends to think that the institutions are bad and that that's not the way people should live anymore. But I think for him, it was the outside world that was a greater threat, because he wouldn't have had the protection and the support that he felt. He always knew he needed levels of support. He might not have been able to. I don't think he would have understood or taken on board the term learning disability and related it to himself. He wouldn't have thought along those lines. I think he thought he was in there because he didn't have a family that wanted him, that he was left. He had got incredible resources at finding where to go when he needed something, and I guess that's because he'd had to do that. There was no family involved. We did trace his family eventually, but they didn't want to know him. They didn't want anything to do with him. And he had got a sister and 2 brothers, but they said they didn't want to know him and they didn't want to be contacted again. So that was it, and we got his birth certificate and things for him. But he did know to go to places like, he'd go to Age Concern, for instance, and he'd find places to go where they did lunch clubs. And he always worked that out for himself. And I guess that's a natural thing about needing food. Can't cook, because he could never cook for himself. He was never any good at doing that. He would eventually go and buy some frozen meals and put them in a microwave, but that was the most he would do. So he never learned any cooking skills or domestic skills, if you like, while he was in Middlefield. And he never learned them afterwards either. So he used to go to Age Concern or places. He did cope, but I say he was very unhappy, and he was very happy when he went back to Knoll. But he'd always, while he'd been in Knoll, I used to go on holiday. I used to go to Bognor Regis and to Weston-super-Mare. And he always had a longing to live by the sea. So from Knoll, he said to me one day, because I used to visit him all the time, or he'd phone me up all the time, and he said he wanted to move to Plymouth. So at that point I thought, is this going to be like when he came out of Middlefield? Because for the last 20 years, I've been around for him to ask if there was something went wrong or there were problems. I'd always been there, and I thought, what will happen? But I tried, although it felt at the time against my better judgment, and that was me, to encourage him to go. And I said, if that's what you want, we'll sort it out. But he did manage, and I think, well, I know it was because he told me it was. Being down in Plymouth by the sea was the happiest time of his life, which was lovely. And he did tell me that. He ended up back in an institutional care in an old people's home, which didn't actually bother him. He actually liked, very interested, he liked being in hospital. And I think that was because it was the institutional background where he got people looking after him again. People were feeding him, his meals were regular, so he never had the worry of any of that. And most people don't want to be in hospital, but he was always very happy. And he did have quite ill health, really. And he did spend a lot of time in hospital, but was never unhappy about going in. In fact, he used to tell you which was the best hospital to be in and where they did the best food and where he could do whatever. So I just always thought he'd never moved on from that institutional mode. Although he came out when he was 23, that was all he knew, and that was where he was most comfortable. But he did say that being in Plymouth, he was happy.